Good morning. Happy Thanksgiving, post-Thanksgiving, continuing Thanksgiving. You may remember, if you were here last year on Christ the King Sunday, AJ's sermon where he mentioned or brought up the fact that today's feast day is not a very old one. Christ the King Sunday. Pope Pius created it back in 1925 out of a concern for the way the world was moving, away from faith in an eternal and all-loving God, and towards secularism and a trust in earthly powers of a very different kind. The Pope has originally established Christ the King Sunday on the last Sunday in October, around All Hallows and All Saints. It wasn't until 1970 that it was moved to its current place in the church calendar, which is today, the last Sunday before Advent. And the Sunday before Advent feels like a good place to remind ourselves of the glory of God. For the last 25 Sundays, we've been moving through ordinary time, and it may have started to feel like that, ordinary. Those months and months following the joy of the resurrection, the awe of the ascension, the fiery mystery of Pentecost. It's felt like a long time since we've focused on the majesty and glory of a heavenly King, and now we're about to step into a new liturgical season, this season of anticipation, of waiting and watching for the birth of the Messiah, the Prince of Peace, Christ, the baby born to unsheltered refugees, Christ, the King of all creation, born in a barn, with angels singing in the heavens. Glory with a little bit of ordinary still in there. And all of today's readings for Christ the King Sunday explore the idea of kingship in different ways, while at the same time they turn the idea of kingship on its head a bit. Images that challenge not only how we think of Christ's role and God's role in the world, but also push us to think about how we are to respond to that upside-down idea of kingship. Over and over, we're reminded that Christ the King is not a king who rules with an iron fist, a king who rules only because he's interested in politics or in wealth, but a king who looks to the common good, who governs to make sure that the weakest and the most vulnerable are cared for and are part of community and communion. Christ the King is a different kind of royalty, ruling from a state of love, not a state of power and self-interest. We read that God is nourishing. In our Old Testament reading, Ezekiel, God is something we think of often in the New Testament as associated with Jesus, that image of the Good Shepherd. I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep, God says. I will seek the lost, and I will bring back the strayed. I will bind up the injured, and I will strengthen the weak. I will feed them with justice. For Ezekiel, the work of God as king is the work of a king who takes care of those he is put in charge of, rescuing those who've gotten lost, making sure that everyone is fed not just with regular everyday food, but fed with justice, not just with acts of kindness, but with attention to a society that has resulted in those who are weak and injured and lost, while others stand on solid ground. God is creative. If we look at the psalm today, it's a psalm of praise and thanksgiving, which is a good reading for this week as well. And it also presents God not only as a king and as a shepherd again, but as somebody who creates. In his hands are the caverns of the earth, and the heights of the hills are his also. The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands have molded the dry land. God, king above all gods, shepherd of God's people, is also a creative and creating God. In the poetry of the psalm, God has dug the caverns of the earth. He's built hills and mountains, the contours of the earth. God has poured the deep ocean. In our society, we don't think The people who hold power and the way that we access it is often wrapped up in red tape, in laws and regulations and social hierarchy. Yet the psalm describes God as creative and nurturing and envisioning, and invites us to celebrate in turn by creating, by singing. God is unifying. The writer of Ephesians tells us that God has sent Christ to put all things under his feet, has made him the head over all things of the church, that Christ's very person is the church that holds us all together. Christ the King is not sent to divide and conquer, but to reconcile and to bring peace. God is eternal. Ephesians describes God as constant, not bound by time, not temporary. God's rule and authority and power and dominion are not only in this age, but in the age to come. God is constant. God's work and God's goodness do not end. And lastly, God is with us, both king and subject, both divine and human. In today's gospel, Jesus reminds us that in caring for one another and in loving one another, we are caring for and loving God by describing the most startling upside-down image of God as king yet. Not just a king sitting on his throne of glory, but a king who is among his people and lives and suffers with them, whose face is seen in the faces of those who grieve, who hunger, who thirst, and who are imprisoned. Come, you that are blessed by my Father. You will come and inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. The gospel brings us right back to the Old Testament, to the image of the Good Shepherd. We are all strangers, and we are all shepherds. This Christ the King Sunday reminds us that God's view of kingship is different from our earthly idea of kingship. It is an idea of a king that is shepherding and nourishing, creator and creating, eternal and lasting, reconciling and peace-giving, and most of all, a king who lives with the least of these, who hungers and thirsts, who lives among us in the lives of the sick, the poor, the hungry, and the imprisoned. A king we will not find in the places we expect to find a king, not in the comfortable halls of power, but in the uncomfortable, backwater, impoverished, and forgotten byways. When we look for Christ in the streets of poorest Bethlehem, we will find ourselves. Amen.